This is Jim Daneker from Arcade Orchestra. Welcome to Legends and Legacies, featuring iconic artists who shaped the sound, the look, and the timeless impact of the 80s. These are the voices who defined a generation. Today's guest joins us all the way from Scotland. He's a founding member of a band who brought you mega hits like Something About You and Lessons in Love. 40 years later, they are still selling out shows around the world. Let's get into it with Mike Lindup of Level 42. Joining us all the way from Scotland today, please welcome founder, keyboard player, one of the most innovative bands of the 80s. It's still doing things today. Mike Lindup, Level 42. Mike, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So, and forgive me, I'm having to check notes and stuff on my iPad here. So give us your background. Tell us the story. What led you, through, what were your musical influences? What led you to Level 42?
Well, I had parents that were both musicians. My mum was a singer-songwriter and composer, and my dad was an arranger and an orchestrator. So my dad came from a kind of jazz background, did a lot of jazz arranging and orchestrating, then got into TV and film music and library music. And my mum, so my dad's from England. My mum's from Belize in Central America.
Okay.
And she came actually in the Second World War at first to the UK to serve as a young 18, 19-year-old, and then came back and settled permanently. And kind of she could sing naturally, but that wasn't her career intention. She actually enrolled at the London School of Economics, but she'd started to support her subsistence by going to the folk clubs. And I think in the sort of, in the 50s and early 60s, there were very much a kind of open mic situation there. And of course, there were people who'd come to the UK from all over the place, from the Commonwealth, etc., that would go and sing songs. And she just found naturally that she could do that. And a career started off for her. So I grew up in a house where, the sitting room was kind of like my playroom. There was pianos, there was mum's guitars, there was some hand drums. There was a reel-to-reel recorder at one stage that mum used to tape her rehearsals on.
Wow. Okay.
And of course there was the radiogram with all the record collection, which was very eclectic, from classical to folk to pop to musical soundtracks. And, my mum used to sing around the house. She used to have people coming to accompany her and rehearse with her in the sitting room. My dad in the early days would be up in his little study with his little arranger's piano. So yeah, that's kind of where I started. And I had private piano lessons from the age of 6.
Okay.
And then I went to a full-time music school at 14 up in Manchester for 4 years. And then from there, I went to the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, which was like a music college, which took, after that. And that's where I met Phil Gould, the original drummer in Level 42, because he was having part-time lessons there.
Okay.
And we had a jam, and we started talking about what kind of music we liked, and we realized we had some things in common. And then later on, he introduced me to his brother Boone and to Mark King, who was a drummer at that stage.
Yeah. And
I was actually playing drums as well in a sort of cover band at college. So we were all very much interested in who's the best drummer, and comparing, Tony Williams to Steve Gadd to Billy Cobham to Lenny White. And that was the thing that sort of tied us together. And eventually we thought, why not actually start a group of our own? And by then Mark had picked up the bass, and I booked the percussion room at the Guildhall, and that was where we had our first jam sessions.
Okay. Fun. That's gosh, between you and Mark, you had your hands full with drummers. That's awesome. So you grew up with a lot of pretty wide variety of musical influences. When I listen back to, of course, this last weekend, just doing some research, listening to your catalog, you guys kind of stand alone in obviously this is very focused on the 80s, the stuff that we're doing. But, when I go back and contemplate your catalog, you guys were kind of a jam band. I mean, you had the jazz, infusion type thing, kind of unusual in those days, I think. I mean, there were certainly others that were doing that kind of thing, but reflects pretty well on the fact that you had a really wide range of influences.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, probably the musicians and the bands that initially drew us were all from the Miles Davis diaspora, from the kind of In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew period, who all went on to do their own things. So, you know, John McLaughlin, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, you know, Wayne Shorter, Joe Zawinul. You know, we'd be sort of really digging Mahavishnu Orchestra and Return to Forever and Headhunters and, you know, Weather Report, as well as, you know, real groove stuff like James Brown and Stevie Wonder. And, you know, Mark was really into Cream when he was younger. But that was the kind of, you know, when we first started jamming, it was all instrumental stuff. We kind of, you know, of course, like a young band, you want to emulate your heroes.
Right.
So, you know, lots of kind of bass grooves and, you know, sort of chord patterns, and then occasional top lines. And it wasn't until our first producer, Andy Soiker, who had an independent label in North London, came and heard us. Now, he was plugged into something we knew nothing about, which was this whole kind of underground jazz funk scene that had been bubbling up in the late 70s.
Yeah.
And he heard the potential that our music could cross over to them. So he said, can you make this tune that you've got into into a song instead of an instrumental, put lyrics to it, and then I'll sign you to my little label to do an album and a couple of singles. And so that was kind of our first break, if you like.
Yeah. Do you find that, you know, in our industry that tends to always want to pigeonhole artists into, I don't know, relatively narrow categories? Did you guys have any struggle with that? I mean, trying to figure out who you were musically from the label perspective, that kind of thing? Or, you know, was the jam band kind of thing enough of a world unto its own that you didn't really have trouble with that?
Well, I guess we were fortunate in that the first single that we released, a track called Love Meeting Love, you know, it kind of got into the bottom of the charts partly through our Phil and Boone's brother, who was kind of became our first manager. He was working at MCA Records in promotions, and he had a few connections, and we got a bit of airplay from that. And all the kind of jazz funk DJs jumped on top of what we were doing, because there were other bands coming out the UK like Light of the World and Lynx and so on. Yeah. But it was kind of like it took us on a side turn, because that's not what we intended to do. I mean, like I said, we wanted to be, you know, like Return to Forever or Mahavishnu Orchestra or whatever. But because we had this deal, then, you know, the invitation was, okay, can we make songs out of these instrumentals that we're writing? Yeah. And so we did 2 singles. The album that we did with Andy Soiker never came out initially, but Polydor Records were kind of looking around. And in those days, it seems strange to say it now, but, you know, record companies would have scouts, and they'd be looking to sign up a couple of bands that were on some new wave that was happening and take a chance, you know. Right. And the whole concept of, you know, then artist development happened. So they gave us a sort of standard contract, which was 3 albums in 3 years plus 2 1-year album options. Yeah. And our very first album that came out, which was the eponymous Level 42 record, I think did quite decent sales. And so the record company were happy that they found a band that had an audience and could, you know, move a certain amount of product. Yeah. And we were happy because we'd written all our own stuff, and we'd proved that we didn't, you know, need any kind of outside help. Sure. And so that was the path that was set. Yeah. That's great. Yeah. You talked about artist development. That's, I mean, talk about a lost concept, you know, these days. If you don't, you know, sell 1 million records, or if you're not blowing up TikTok, you're dropped. And that's if you've got a deal. So, okay, the obvious. In 1985, World Machine debuted and fueled by the hit single Something About You, which everybody's heard, everybody loves. Did you guys have any sense when you were writing that song, working on that song, that it was going to do what it did? I mean, did it feel different than the other stuff you were doing at all? Or did you just felt like, hey, this is an obvious track to put out there, or any sense of... I mean, probably what happened is that prior to the writing of all of those songs on the World Machine album, Mark had sort of given everybody an ultimatum. He kind of said, look, I think this band can do a lot better commercially if we take our time to really, pre-prepare the songs that we go into the studio. Because prior to that, we'd sort of go into the studio with about half the songs written and a few loose ideas, and we'd jam it, and with the deadline of like, this is the end of your recording period coming towards us.
Sure.
We'd pull stuff out of the bag, like the record Hot Water, for example, which was a kind of, what else have we got? Oh, we got this old riff that Mark came up with. Let's see if we can make it into a song. And so kind of with the World Machine album, by that time, the sort of technology had moved so that we had available like an 8-track studio. Mark had one up in his loft and so on. And so we go there and we demo stuff. And the ideas that became Something About You, which was really, a lot of the songs were split between 2, 3, 4 writers. In the case of Something About You, it's 5, because our co-writer and sort of fifth Beatle, Wally Badarou, was also involved in the creating of that. I mean, I felt it was a good song. I think we all felt it was a good song at the demo stage. And then when we went into the studio, for whatever reason, it was one of those songs that we put down the backing track, and it kind of sounded okay, but it didn't really come to life in the way that we thought it could. And added to that was the record company heard a sort of work in progress tape and kind of gave it a bit of a thumbs down and saying, maybe you guys need to get some other writers in. The material isn't sounding that strong. And we were like, what? This is the best material we've come up with for ages. So kind of with that fire lit, then we went back to the studio and started working on the backing track of the song. With the sort of snare, adding electronics to the snare sound. Wally Badarou came up with some extra keyboard parts. And then the big deal was that generally Phil or Boone wrote lyrics, and they kind of like chose which song they were going to work on. And Phil had been working on the lyrics for the Something About You song. And then one day out of the blue, Boone walked in with these reams of lyrics. And I remember Mark putting them down on the desk, looking at them, saying, these are great words, we should try them. And so we did that. I mean, Phil's nose was a little bit out of joint, let's say, because it was kind of his song up until that point. But we went and sang Boone's words to the melody, put a few backing vocals on, with the great Julian Mendelssohn engineering. We came back in the studio, had a listen, and suddenly it's like the thing was transformed. We got in our A&R guy from Polydor and said, have a listen. And he kind of sat back and he went, yep, sounds like a hit to me. And so the song got released and in Europe, and then, of course, in America, where we had just had no idea. We just knew that it was getting a lot of airplay. And when we were doing shows in America at that time, opening for Madonna and Tina Turner later on, and Steve Winwood previously, we were doing little club tours in between, very Spinal Tap-ish, I must admit, going to a club in the middle of nowhere. No one's heard of you. Who's the band on Wednesday? Oh, it's these guys from Europe, Level 42. And then we put Something About You as our last song. And it was like, yes, we know this song. We know this band. And so, but I mean, you don't know. You don't know what legs a song is going to have. You have no idea.
I remember, now this will date me, but let's see, that was 85. I remember hearing that. So, I mean, my childhood was, I was the only person who was musical in my family, and grew up a little sheltered, in some ways, certainly musically. The only thing in our house was what my mom would typically have on the record player, which was Kenny Rogers and Anne Murray. And so my diet was, it was either John Williams, absorbed in film music, or 80s pop radio. And it was an interesting mix, and I've taken that all through my career. But I remember, of course, all these songs. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. But that song, you mentioned the mix too, and the engineering. It just popped. It had a really great sound, and I mean, it was one of many pieces from that time period that just. I got a theory that everything kind of started shifting right around 85 sonically. everything still, you'd still have a little bit of organic holdover from even the late 70s through about 83, 84 in terms of the way things were engineered. But all of a sudden you had, AMS, the AMS reverb and delays, everybody was using that stuff. And it just fundamentally changed the sound of pop production. And, as a student of that stuff, I can hear it a mile away, but all this to say that song really jumped out in a lot of ways. And all my keyboard player buddies, it's one that we talk about. So, so on the back of that one, you recorded Lessons in Love in 86, which went on, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, that one you did that as a single that ended up being on the following album, right? Is that right?
Yes, it was kind of like the success of Something About You and Leaving Me Now and the World Machine album was such, and we were really busy doing lots of touring, in Europe, going to America, coming back to Europe. The record company kind of said, we don't want to wait until the next album. We think, we need another single now. Can you guys, come up with something? And so we went into the studio with 3 tracks. What became Lessons in Love, Children Say, and a track called Freedom Someday, which was a bonus track on the Running a Family album. So we started working all those, and it became clear that Lessons in Love was the one that was... It was a similar thing because, I wasn't that keen on it until the vocals went on.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it sort of, again, it came to life when the vocals went on and the lyric. And, now looking back with hindsight at Boone's lyrics on both of those songs, they're really incredible lyrics that if you take them, because I do a sort of unplugged version of Something About You sometimes in other situations.
Yeah.
And those words are amazing. Yeah. And they can... One of the things I think about a really good lyric is you can take it slow, you can take it into different context, you can strip away everything, and the song still stands up. And so I think similarly with Lessons in Love, as it was with Something About You. And that did, amazingly, Lessons in Love was like #1 in about 7 or 8 countries. That was, probably technically speaking, our biggest hit in terms... and of course it had to be included in the Running Family album when we eventually found a 3-week gap to go into the studio to do that album.
Yeah. I was digging through, the catalog, looking at YouTube videos, and there's a video of you guys playing, I don't have the title of it in front of me, but it was in 2010, and it was that song, and it was an outdoor thing, and you talk about lessons in live musicianship is what that video should be called, because it really cemented for me just how tight you guys are as a band. And I think that's one of the things that sets you apart and speaks to your history, the influences that you guys had. It's mind-boggling. First of all, Mark is up there playing, the bass the way that he does, chewing gum, singing lead vocals. I mean, all this stuff, and then what you guys are doing on keys. And I don't know who's playing drums, younger guy.
Pete Ray Biggin.
Oh my gosh. I mean, stellar. Everything on stage really combined. What makes Level 42 such a unique band? I mean, there's lots of great bands, but, in the 80s in particular, and this kind of speaks to my next point, peak 80s, Lindrum was everywhere. I mean, drum machines, obviously synthesizers, everything, so much sequencing. And you guys had a lot of cool stuff in terms of textures, and certainly for my synthesizer buddies, we'll touch on that here in a minute. But one thing I noticed is there's hardly any drum machines on any of your stuff. And that kind of jumped out at me a little bit. Was that, and it's not like you needed them. I mean, you had guys like Phil Gould playing. Was that a conscious thing, or was it just a product of this is who we are as a band? It's not part of our deal.
I think I mean, we weren't against it. We did use it. So,
Yeah.
for example, on Mark had bought an MPC. I bought one as well, and then he bought a Lin 9000 around that time. And in fact, the drums on Lessons in Love and Children Say are actually samples,
right,
of Phil's snare,
right,
programmed.
Yeah.
But then what Phil is doing is he's playing along and doing like the skip beats on the snare,
Right.
and playing live hi-hat. So,
Yeah.
you kind of get a hybrid thing. And
Yeah.
if you saw the band live in kind of 85, 86, Phil would have his acoustic kit, and then he'd have a couple of Simmons pads or
Sure.
something like that to sort of try and emulate what we'd done on the record.
Yeah.
But most of the time it was kind of live drums. I mean, we kind of later on we got into drum loops,
Sure.
sort of around the Forever Now time.
Yeah.
So we weren't against drum machines, but then, I suppose coming from a proud heritage of drummers that we admired, we weren't going to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sure. Yeah, it's just funny. As I was, going through and listening to things, I'm like, you know what? I'm not hearing many overt, certainly not drum patterns or anything. I mean, when you listen to Lessons in Love, I'm like, okay, you can tell you're using samples and all that kind of thing. But like you said, plenty of live hi-hats, all those human elements tying things together. So in 1990, you released your first solo album, I believe, Changes, featuring Dominic Miller, who, for those who don't know, Dominic, well known for playing guitar with Sting. You still play. You're just finishing some dates with Dominic, I believe. Is that right?
That's right. I just finished a bunch of dates with him in Europe.
So long-time friend of yours, I guess, right?
Well, we actually met at the Guildhall School of Music, the college, music college I was at,
right,
in 1978. In fact, I was playing drums in the percussion room, and he walked in with an electric guitar, plugged it in, and said, "Listen to this." And then we had a jam session. And in fact, he was kind of the first guitarist in the sort of proto level 42. In other words, when we had our first jam session, I invited Dominic, and there was me, Dominic, Phil, and Mark, did a jam session. And then the next time Boone had joined with his guitar. And then for whatever reason, Dominic sort of didn't show up to the next rehearsal. And so he didn't become part of the band. Although later on he did play on this couple of albums, Staring at the Sun and the Guaranteed album. But his career was then, once he met Sting in 89, that was it. And he's been doing that ever since. Yeah. And he writes great solos, instrumental stuff too, which I'm happy to be part of his band when he does that.
Yeah. Yeah. You had kind of a dream team on that on Changes, your Changes record. You had Dominic, you had Pino Palladino, bass legend, Manu Katché. I mean, it had to be kind of a dream to work with those guys.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. And I mean, it was thanks to Dominic, because Dominic had a group with Pino and Manu at the time.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought, well, if I can't have Phil Gould on drums, who would I get? And I thought, well, it'd be amazing to get Manu. Yeah. And so I asked him, and he said yes. And so he's and Pino as well. They're playing on all the tracks. And it was. I mean, I've played previously on Dominic's solo stuff before Changes, and so it was kind of natural that I'd get him on to do that, because we just have that link.
Always fun when somebody at that level says, "Sure, I'll play on your project." I mean, I've had that happen a few times. I'm like, you don't expect it to go that way, and so it's always pleasant when that happens. So I read in that, I think it was around 2001, you decided to stop touring, at least for a while. Mike, having toured extensively myself, I spent almost 3 decades touring with I don't even know if you know who he is, a guy named Michael W. Smith. He's huge in his market. And so I get the need to leave the road, but for the sake of the audience who always scratches their head when you announce, I'm leaving a really cool gig, what's your perspective on that? Why, any thoughts that?
Well, it kind of happened slightly differently, and it was earlier. So, we'd level 42. We had a sort of big divorce with Polydor in around 1990, and we joined RCA Records. And the album that Polydor didn't want to release, Guaranteed, came out on RCA.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went to the studio to record what would turn out to be the Forever Now album, and that came out in '94. But by then, the kind of scene had changed. And if you like, the wave that we were on was dropping because the focus was on, dance music and indie music and boy bands.
Yeah.
And the A&R guy at RCA had famously sort of championed Take That and signed them. And you could see that's where the focus was.
Sure.
And we felt like we weren't really getting the backup, the promotional backup for this album that we'd taken a long time to record.
Yeah.
And so Mark and I said, you know what, let's put it on ice. We spent 15 years doing album tour. Let's just have a break. So at the end of '94, we stopped. Mark went off and did a solo album in '98. I was doing other things, and then Mark started playing as a Mark King group, and then he wanted to go out as Level 42 because he was playing a lot of Level 42 stuff, and we came to an arrangement where he could do that. And I didn't want to rejoin the band at that time because I was pursuing other things, musical and non-musical. And it was then in 2005, on the 25th anniversary, that Mark invited me to come to the stage and play and join another keyboard player that had been part of the group. And that went, as soon as Mark and me were on stage, having not spent those previous years together, it just clicked immediately. And in 2006, there was a new album, and I got involved in that and then did the tour, and I've been with Level 42 ever since then. And actually, I think for both of us, there was a benefit of having had that time off and time away from each other. Because, I'm sure a lot of long-lived bands, their marriages. I mean, a lot of them last longer than marriages. And, sometimes it's good to get a bit of space.
Yep, absolutely. Looking back, is there anything that you would do differently or anything you wish had played out differently in those days?
Well, I mean, when Phil and Boone left in '87, I felt very sad because it felt like we were just reaping the fruits of all of that hard work and all of those tours that we'd done.
Yeah.
And I felt it was a shame that the original band was splitting up at that time. Yeah. And if there's been a way that we could have stayed together. But, it's like Mark was pulling one way, Phil was pulling another way. I was kind of in the middle. And so you can look back and say, I wish that hadn't happened. But then other things wouldn't happen if that hadn't happened. So I don't really have any regrets.
Yeah.
I think I learnt quite a few lessons, if you like, from all the things that did happen, which I now can say, I have the wisdom of those experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Who were some of your peers in those days that you admired creatively? I mean, the 80s were such a broad swath. I mean, different genres.
Yes. I mean, we would do, I don't know if, how many of your listeners have heard of a program called Top of the Pops. But,
sure.
It's such a shame that program's gone. It was so great to do.
Yeah.
Because it was, of course, one of those things. It was the TV. Everyone tuned in on a Thursday night to see who was where in the charts, who'd gone up, who was down, who was new, So we'd often bump into our peers, groups like UB40, Simply Red, oh my goodness, Human League, Thompson Twins.
Oh man.
Robert Palmer. I mean, it was just incredible. Whitney Houston.
Yeah.
And there would always generally be a bit of sort of, peer rivalry, let's say, where you're a fairly young band and you've had some success and you see Duran Duran over there and you think, well, they might be big, but we're better than them, in your head, of course. Sure, you don't say that to their face. But of course, looking back with hindsight, and listening to the songs that have, if you like, survived and weathered and become evergreen, you think, wow, that was a really rich period of stuff that we're in. And so now when we do festivals, we do quite a few sort of 80s themed festivals around Europe and the UK. and further abroad. And now when we meet each other, it's kind of like, hey, we all survived, you know,
Yeah,
we're still
right.
here doing it. And
Yeah.
there's a real kind of appreciation.
Yeah.
I mean, there were certain records that I loved. Scritti Politi's The Word Girl.
Oh my
You
gosh.
know,
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about production.
Yes. Oh
I
my
remember
word.
hearing that on the radio for the first time when we were in the studio, you know,
Yeah.
making the World Machine album, thinking, wow, who are they? Where are they from? You know?
Yep. It's funny you say that, Mike. The guy that I toured with for almost 30 years, one of our traditions, every tour, inevitably, we would have a bus, you know, on the tour bus, we'd have a night. It lasted all night long. Jam session, basically, just taking turns with the iPod, you know, whatever it is at the time, passing it around. And it inevitably always centered around the 80s because that's what we all grew up on. Now that the guy, Michael, his name was, he's 15 years older than me. So he was kind of a trailblazer during that time too. But Scritti Politti, that some of that stuff, your stuff, when that stuff would come on, I mean, the volume knob would progressively get louder and louder where, you know, but we would be drooling over the production and the writing, the lyrics, you know, you talked about earlier. There was just such a tapestry of incredible stuff. And it was the perfect storm, you know, in so many ways, technology, music, and there were no rules. I don't know if you remember Amy Grant, interviewed her a couple weeks ago, and we were talking, and she made a great point. She said, you know, one of the things about that decade was that wherever we were fully present. And that jumped out at me. You know, that's so true. You know, we didn't have the distraction of a phone in our face all the time. And just what an amazing time. If you could go back, and I'm trying to be careful not to phrase things in terms of, you know, could have, would have, should have. But if you could go back and work with anyone in the 80s that you haven't, who might that be? Any?
Well, I mean, my number one artist would be someone who came up in the 60s, I'm afraid to say. Well, that would be Stevie.
Yeah.
You know, I'd love to work with Stevie or have, you know, been in the studio with him.
Which
Stevie Wonder.
Stevie Wonder, yeah, I figured.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah.
But in terms of answering your question, in the 80s, the Scritti Politti guys, that would have been great to work with them. Let's see, who else?
And it doesn't have to be 80s. I think Stevie's a great answer. That informs who you are. I mean, you know.
I mean, you know, there was some amazing singers. I mean, as a writer, I'd love to have, you know, written or worked with, you know, Whitney Houston. That would have been incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, we were lucky that we were produced by two of the guys from Earth, Wind and Fire in 1983 on the Standing the Light album. I mean, it could have been great to sort of done more stuff with them, as it were, on their projects, as opposed to them producing our project. Although at the time we wouldn't have been ready for that.
Yeah.
Oh Lord, I don't know. It's hard to say. It's I can't think of a. I'm sure as soon as this call is finished, I'll think about three artists straight away.
Well,
but
fair enough. This is always a fun one that everybody wants to know. Favorite gig you've ever played?
Yes, I'm always reluctant to actually pick one gig or one song or one album. But if I was forced, you know, with my arm twisted behind my back, I would probably say Glastonbury in 1986.
Yeah.
It was the first time we'd kind of headlined. Well, the only time we've headlined there. It was kind of before it got onto the TV. You know, it was still being run by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, would you believe?
Sure.
But there were about 50,000 people there. We went on stage just at the right time, just as it was getting dark.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where everything worked. Like, as you know, it doesn't always work this way. The sound on stage was great.
Yeah.
We were all playing really well. The sound out front was great.
Sure.
And, you know, just the vibe that we had coming off was just a real high. It was a very, very special night.
That's great. Hey, thanks for listening. In case you're wondering, what's Arcade Orchestra? Well, what if you could go back and actually relive the 80s? Not just listen to the music, but actually travel back in time and experience the best of the decade in a fully immersive experience that engages all 5 senses. We are building this experience, and it's called Arcade Orchestra. If you'd like to know more, be sure to follow us on our socials, YouTube channel, and arcadeorchestra.com. Now back to Legends and Legacies. Yeah, festivals especially can be such a gamble. I remember we did one in Brazil one time, and there were 100,000 people, and monitors all went out. We had no monitors, and right in the middle of the first song, and this could be a disaster. And I think it was being broadcast, and perfect storm in the wrong way. And but boy, yeah, when everything's firing on all cylinders and everything sounds great and it's connecting, there's nothing like that. Okay, all of my synthesizer followers, and there's a lot of those, they'll be upset if we don't talk shop for a minute, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you consider yourself a gearhead? I mean, I know obviously you've played a lot of synths over the years, but is that something that you really gravitate to? Are you technically minded, or do you just is it more of whatever's in front of you and you make it work?
Kind of the latter, I would say. I'm not. I mean, if I had an unlimited budget, I would probably be, buying or exploring more new keyboards. I mean, it feels like it's a golden time now to be a keyboard player, because you have all the legacy stuff, you have all the modern stuff that can do the old stuff but can also do new stuff. You have all the plugins, you have all the kind of hybrid things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess I was lucky because Wally Badarou, he was a real programmer and a real technical guy, and he was the one who introduced me to the Prophet 5 and what you could get out of a Prophet 5. And to watch him sort of creating a sound and sometimes seemingly taking ages, well, it sounds great. No, it's not there. I need just to do this. Okay.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, when I went on stage, of course, on each of the recordings, there's normally me and Wally playing all the keyboards. Sometimes Mark would sort of do a couple of things as well. But essentially live on stage, I had to reproduce the sound of 2 keyboard players with just being me.
Yeah.
So I needed an orchestra around me. So hence, I had to have several keyboards that I could quickly jump from one to the other. So it was, and Wally, he brought synclavier to the World Machine and running of the family projects. And I somehow had to emulate those. Well, obviously, I'm not going to go and buy a synclavier. Not in those days when they cost the same as a house.
Exactly.
But so I had the Prophet 5 and the Mini Moog and the Rhodes. That was the kind of the beginning of the building blocks. And then a DX7, of course, when it came out. And then I got a PPG with the kind of wave synthesis, which meant I could somehow emulate the sounds that came out of the synclavier.
Yeah.
And then, various Yamaha sort of digital keyboards, and then, samplers, Emulator 3.
Yeah.
And by then, I had pretty much everything that we needed covered.
Yeah.
And then certain keyboards would come out, like the Korg, M1. Of course, I explored that, and later the O1W and the Trinity.
Yeah.
And then of course more recently when Dave Smith started recreating the Prophet, or rather coming up with sort of new ideas based on the concept, like the Prophet 08 and the Rev 2. I had to get involved in those. I mean, I suppose I'm more of an analog synth man, but I did have that Roland synth that you've got directly behind you. I had one of those for a while.
Which,
and what I would find
8P, the
JP 800.
That one. Yeah, it's a monster. Yeah.
And I would find that if I found a sound that was new and interesting, quite often, like, that would inspire a new composition or a new idea. So I'd sometimes go into the music shops when such a thing was a thing, really, and just try some of the new keyboards. And often you go through the patches and you think, yeah. and especially in the 90s, they'd always put loads of chorus and
Right.
delay and reverb, and these big washes of sound.
Right.
And you think, okay, that's great, sounds great on its own, but it wouldn't necessarily fit, in a sort of group context, because the speciality with Level 42 is that there's not so much frequency space available, because Mark's bass with the drums, that filled up a whole lot of space harmonically as well as sonically.
Yeah.
So I had to find a way to add to that without sort of trying to compete with it.
Yeah.
And it's a particular thing. And then there was Wally as well. And so, we had to find sounds that would enhance the songs that work with the already sort of big sound of the bass and the drums.
Right. Well, whatever you did a great job, because when you listen to the the keyboard parts on the two singles, of course, in particular, I like how you talk about that in terms of, there's harmonic ranges and frequency ranges, and there's only so much space. And, you got that pulsating, like the clav type thing, and then the intro patch on Lessons in Love. I mean, they're really creative sounds that you didn't hear a lot in, of course, there's all kinds of keyboard sounds back then, but that's another ingredient to me that made Level 42 really kind of unique. There was always that driving pulse type synth stuff happening, and then you had textural things. And any favorites today? Any gear favorites that you're really attracted to?
I'm liking some of the new. I mean, I can't think of necessarily the make and manufacturer. So, but I've been watching some of the recent, YouTube videos from the trade fairs, and there seems to be a kind of a new wave of, if you like, digital synths based on FM and wave synthesis coming in, but with kind of, with knobs, so you can program the damn things.
Yeah.
But also sounding really, really great and interesting. So that stuff I'm interested in.
Yeah. Have you heard the Third Wave by Groove Synthesis? This is basically a PPG remake.
I think I heard a demo of it, and it sounded very beautiful.
I did a YouTube. I don't do many YouTube reviews of gear. I don't have time, but I did one. I got that one based on one demo I heard, and it's the first, probably only time. I mean, I got a lot of keyboards, but I was never actually a huge PPG fan. I got it because it also emulates a lot of analog, vintage analog stuff. But it just seemed to be a really unique combination. I actually boxed it up to send it back after spending an hour with it. But I thought, well, I've got it here. Let me give it another chance. By the end of the weekend, I fell so head over heels for that thing. And this video that I did, the what do you call it? The screenshot or thumbnail says 0 to hero. Because I went from, I don't like this thing at all, to it's like the synth of the century to me, because it really marries the PPG stuff really well with, now it does sampling. They did an upgrade. It does all kinds of things. It's just stunning. So anyway, back to Lessons in Love for a second. There are 7 bass lines. If I read right, there's 7 bass lines in that song. There's 3 analog synths, 2 FM synths, and 2 electric basses. You got a Synclavier, Prophet 5, Prophet 600, DX7, and TX816. Does that sound right?
That sounds like too many basses to me.
Okay. I mean, maybe it's layers. It's they're not different parts necessarily, but
I mean, I know that there was definitely a mixture of analog and digital, kind of keyboard bass.
Yeah,
doubled up by Mark's bass guitar for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, it may be that whoever came up with that has some kind of insider knowledge.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's definitely, the thing is, of course, you've got the clavinet part, which also kind of complements the bass. So I would say it's probably not seven things doing the bass line.
Yeah, right.
But there's probably 7 keyboards doing different things that kind of work with the bass line.
That makes sense. Okay, rounding the bend here a little bit. This is something we're asking everybody. A little bit of philosophical route here. So some of the biggest touring acts I've noticed in the last couple years, other than Taylor Swift, who's a universe unto herself, Journey, Toto, Tears for Fears, Duran Duran, Simple Minds, and Genesis have been the biggest touring acts of the last 5-10 years. Toto and Journey are out filling stadiums. The Top Gun movie that came out a couple years ago, that was the biggest movie that redefined the movie business, essentially. Nostalgia happens in every generation. In the 80s, people were nostalgic for the 50s. But for the first time in history, it seems an entire generation loves their parents' stuff. My daughter is 21, and when I took her to see the Top Gun movie a couple years ago, on the way home, she just chewed my ear the whole way. She said, "You grew up in the best decade. You had the best music, the best movies. Everything was fun and optimistic." And, and that kind of was a catalyst for where I'm going with all this stuff. And then I started talking to all her friends and friends who have kids that age. They all are saying the same thing. They practically idolize the 80s. Do you have any thoughts on why 80s nostalgia in particular is so powerful, especially for a generation who never experienced it the first time around?
Well, yeah. I mean, in answer to the first part of your question about those big acts going out and being like the biggest grossing sort of tours, I actually saw Toto on the first date of their European leg in Glasgow, in whenever it was, and really enjoyed it. I've always felt thankful that you can't put live into a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
You have to actually be there and experience it. And I think it's live is more than the sum of its parts. So you've got the artist that you wanted to see there in person, which is special. You've got whatever songs that they're doing, which hopefully you're a fan of anyway. You've got the big sound, the live sound. You've got the shared experience of being there with everyone else. And I would go out on a limb and say that there's something else that's getting transmitted there, because you're kind of getting the intention that those artists wanted when they're performing those songs.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sort of energetic thing. And, when it works, as you'll know from being on stage when you're actually performing, when you feel that back from the audience and you kind of you give more and they give more and so on, there's something that, just can't be captured on, for example, a live DVD or a live stream.
Yeah.
You're watching the same thing, but it isn't the same experience.
Right.
And I think that's what people love. And that's why I say, thank God you can't put it into a bottle, because it seems that live is a bigger phenomenon than ever, and hopefully always will be.
Yeah.
The other thing about the 80s, though, is I just think it was a rich scene. As I said before, I think just some great songs got written in that era.
Is there anything you are listening to today that really excites you?
I would say, to be honest, I haven't really heard anything, certainly not from the mainstream, that really excites me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there's a few good artists out there that I hope will carry on and mature. I mean, I'm thinking like, Bruno Mars and Lady Gaga, for example. Jacob Collier is fantastic.
Yeah.
I hope he stays around and continues to kind of create and write. I mean, for me, his biggest strength is as an arranger, rather than as a composer. But he potentially, with some more life experiences under his belt, I mean, it'd be astonishing what he could come up with.
Yeah.
There are some artists that are probably not mainstream, that are in the margin, that I hear occasionally, that I just sort of missed when they were out. I mean, like Boards of Canada, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Music Has the Right to Children. Someone introduced me to that just the other day. And although it's a few years old, I absolutely love it, and love where they're coming from. So, I listen to a mixture of, some electronica, a lot of world music.
Mm-hmm.
I love music from the African continent. I love music from South America and Brazil in particular. It's
Mm-hmm.
always been a big thing for me. And I like classical music. I listen at home. I listen to quite a lot of classical music too.
Yeah.
So, I love variety.
Yeah.
And what I hate is formula. And of course, there's always formula, but it seems to me now there's even more formula. And I think the kids need education on harmony and chords.
Mm-hmm.
Please, there are more chords available.
Yes. 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 Oh my gosh. That's funny you say that. I was about to ask you if you could pass down some wisdom to the next generation of musicians and artists from your perspective. What would that be? And you just kind of touched on that.
Yeah, I would say, listen to music way out of your genre, just because it's kind of like ear training.
Yeah.
I was very lucky when I went to state school, when I was like 12, 13, 14, there'd be music lessons as part of the curriculum. They don't really exist anymore in a lot of schools. But the teacher would come in, there'd be a record player sitting in the middle of the classroom, and she'd put on an album, and she put on the Planet Suite, and then we'd listen to that, and she'd talk about the planets.
Yeah.
Or she put on Scheherazade, and she'd talk about the 1001 Nights and what the story was behind that song.
Yeah.
Or put on the Nutcracker Suite or something like that. And that wouldn't necessarily mean that we'd become into Tchaikovsky or into Rimsky-Korsakov.
Yeah.
But it just informed you. And somewhere I think it goes in. And then when you start writing and exploring and looking for things, you've got more strings to your bow. And I think that's really needed now.
Yeah. Yeah. You touch on something that's special to me, or, important to me. I kind of had a similar experience growing up, early 80s, especially music education. That was a big part of the curriculum. And we had, I remember a music teacher, this would have been somewhere in the early 80s, 83, 84 maybe. But we had, it was one of these big choir rooms, so there was all of that world. But they also had a massive stereo system that was probably held over from the 70s. So you had these big speakers, and she did exactly what you're talking about. She put on all these different records, classical. But at that time, Chariots of Fire, was still in the public consciousness, 80, 81, I think that was. And as a kid at the time who, the sound of synthesizers was fascinating to me. So inevitably, when the day came, she put that on the record player, I was just in my element. And then a few years later, Axel F from, Beverly Hills Cop, all that stuff. I was losing my mind. And so that was a part of my, formula and all that kind of thing. The lady who gave me piano lessons, her sons were probably 10 years older than me. They had a rock band, and they were playing a lot of covers, a lot of stuff that they heard on MTV, and I'll never forget going down to their basement. It was like this dark, inner sanctum. They had a B3 and a Leslie, but right there in the middle of the room was a Prophet 5 and a DX7. And they sensed in me, they could see where my life was going, even though I was, however, I was maybe 12 at the time. And they turned me loose. They turned it all on, and they just said, go for it, have fun. That was one of the best hours of my life, because I'm just drooling over the technology while I'm listening to people like you, and and what a great time to be alive and to be coming up as a budding keyboard player. But all that to say, the music education, boy, you're so right. We really need that, and it's so important that kids have that. Almost done here, Mike. What do you consider your greatest accomplishment?
Oh, I just think probably the fact that it's been 45 years since we started Level 42, and that we're getting, offers to play concerts and tours. I mean, the tour that we're doing celebrating 40 years of World Machine this year. I mean, I can't remember the last time that we had to add extra dates because the tour had, more or less sold out at the end of last year. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So I think, I'm very proud to have been a founder member and a part of something that, still gives me joy. We have so much fun on stage.
Yeah.
and it's opened so many doors for me.
Yeah. You just released a new project, Changes 2.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
It was great. It was actually, I'd been sort of, if you like, collecting ideas and songs over the years leading up to 2019 when I started recording Changes 2. And I'd worked with these two co-producers, Mike Pato and Tony Economidis, on another project. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, these might be good guys to sort of, help me get a new album and bring something new out of me. I wanted, because they work with a lot of kind of soul artists and new soul and kind of also, world music and also club stuff. And I thought they'll bring an edge to whatever I do. Mm-hmm. And so that was great. So we started that. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And at the same time, I moved from London to Scotland. So when I was allowed to, I was like traveling down to do a couple of days here, a couple of days there. And the album actually took 4 years to make. But it was a real pleasure. And it became apparent that a lot of the themes I was exploring were kind of not too dissimilar from ones that I was exploring when I was doing Changes. Only, of course, a 30-year life difference. Mm-hmm. So that's why I call it Changes 2, because it felt important. It felt like a real body of songs that was a real follow-up to what I'd done in 1990.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Last question. Is there anything, because I'm not an interviewer, this is all, a necessary part of what we're doing, so I'm still new at this. Is there anything a decent interviewer should ask you that I've missed?
I can't really think of anything, Jim.
Okay.
I mean, I think you've done a great job, and you've come from what interests you. Mm-hmm. The main thing that I always want from an interviewer, having now done this for 45 years, is for the interviewer to be interested in the person that they're interviewing. Mm-hmm. And to have some kind of background knowledge. Yeah. And I mean, it's fine that you're referring to notes. I would be doing the same thing if I was interviewing someone that I'd really admired. But it's obviously that you're passionate about the music and you're really interested. Yeah. So that's all you can ask for. I mean, the worst kind of interview is when someone says, "Oh," and they know nothing about you and they're not really interested, and they're just like, "Oh, how did you get the name Level 42?"
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm learning that too. It's like, you can't just go into these not really having done some research. But yeah, you touched on something there too. If I can be honest, one of my fears with this is, guys like you've been asked the same questions a million times. And there's also the element of, we're talking about the 80s. Do some artists kind of loathe that? I know there's a few that they don't even want to be considered an 80s band. One of them is massive. And they're like, they kind of roll their eyes at the whole idea. Can't we talk about something else? But, obviously with what we're doing with Arcade Orchestra, that's the topic, and people still love hearing perspectives from guys like you who lived it. And one of my goals with this is to try and preserve these legacies as much as we can, to tell your stories, because they are, you've heard the phrase, you guys wrote the soundtrack of a generation. And, what we're going to do here, it's not a cover band. It's not, right now we're actually negotiating with a really big venue in Las Vegas to open this as an exclusive residency next year. So it's looking really, really good. And it's fueled by what I was talking about earlier, that not only do you have everybody my age, 10 years either side of that, I'm 52, but everybody who lived through it misses so many things about that time. But like I said, you've got a generation coming up who, if it's possible to have nostalgia for something that they never experienced, that's unheard of. And so I'm trying to tap into that and honor, these legacies, because I really feel like Jason Scheff, he took over for Peter Cetera from Chicago in 1986. And we started talking about this last year, and he made a point that, I thought was important. He said, this is that generation, guys like you wrote stuff and this is Jason's words, he said, that stuff's going to be studied decades from now, the way that we study classical composers. I'm not sure that's that big of a stretch. I think he may be right. There's just something about the material, the technology of the time. It really was a perfect storm, in so many ways. And so on behalf of the generation who you wrote the soundtrack for, we just want to thank you for being part of this and for being accessible and for telling your story. That's what this is all about. So
Thank you. Thank you. That's really great to hear. I mean, I would say that, for my generation, I would certainly say that about the Beatles. That,
sure.
That'll be studied like Mozart and Beethoven are studied in the future. So, it would be an honor to be kind of considered in that same way.
Yeah, you will be. I mean, I have no doubt. All the talking I do with people, all the people who are following us, I get messages all the time from people saying, thank you for doing this and for treating it with honor, because there's a million people that are out playing cover, and there's nothing wrong with cover bands. But we want to do something that's next level and really honor the material. And of course, the way we're going to do it, adding these orchestral elements on top of it, I think it's going to be, it's hard to explain, but when you hear it, I think people are going to be blown away. And I can't take credit for it. It's the material that we're working with, so anyway.
Well, please send me some links when
absolutely will. Absolutely will. Yeah. Well, Mike, again, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And once this comes out, we'll be sure to include you and make sure that you're part of the whole thing. So
fantastic.
All right.
Thanks
again. Yep. Have a great day, my friend.
You too.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got more amazing guests in the pipeline, so please be sure to hit like and subscribe, leave a comment, and follow us on our socials at Arcade Orchestra. For our next episode, we're going to revisit the 80s with a current artist who's just as much a fan as I am, my good friend Jay DeMarcus of Rascal Flatts. So stay tuned, keep being rad, and see you next time on Legends and Legacies.